On the evening of Saturday, 14th of May 1977, a British Army captain left a fortified mill in County Armagh at 9:25, alone, in a red Triumph car. He radioed back to base 4 times over the next 30 minutes, at 9:48, 9:52, 9:56 and 9:58. His final transmission confirmed he had arrived at his destination, a pub called the 3 Steps Inn in the village of Dromintee, 3 miles from the Irish border in South Armagh. After that call, nothing. Inside the pub, he was known as Danny McErlaine, a motor mechanic, a member of the official IRA from Ardoyne in North Belfast. He mingled with the regulars, sang rebel songs. Witnesses record him performing the Broad Black Brimmer with the band playing that night, and moved through the room like a man who belonged. Sometime around 1:45, he was walked out into the car park. He was never seen alive again. His body has never been found, and the unit he belonged to wouldn't be named in a British government document for nearly 30 years. His name was Robert Nairac, Captain Grenadier Guards, and almost everyone who encountered him professionally during his years in Northern Ireland assumed he was something else entirely. They thought he was SAS. He wasn't. The gap between what people believed he was and what he actually was tells you almost everything worth knowing about 14 Intelligence Company, the unit operating under a dozen different cover names, absent from any public government document, which trained officers to disappear into the population of a war zone, and which the British state refused to officially acknowledge, even after it decorated its dead. The SAS mistake wasn't ignorance. It was a structurally logical error made by people who knew exactly what they were looking at and still got it wrong. Nairac's final posting was as a military intelligence liaison officer at Bessbrook Mill, a former linen mill near Newry that the British Army had converted into a major fortified base, helicopter hub and forward operating centre for South Armagh operations. The building had belonged to a Quaker family before the army arrived. By the mid-1970s, it was something else entirely. Multi-pad helicopter infrastructure, segregated accommodation blocks, sandbagged positions, perimeter lighting that blazed through the South Armagh dark. It was the most important military installation in the region, and it housed, simultaneously, a resident infantry battalion, a rotating SAS troop, a detachment of 14 Intelligence Company, and Royal Ulster Constabulary Special Branch liaison officers. All of them operated from the same buildings, moved through the same corridors, attended briefings at varying levels of classification. Nairac's specific job was to serve as the formal link between the SAS squadrons rotating through Bessbrook and the other intelligence and security elements at the base. He attended SAS briefings. He moved in SAS spaces. He knew the SAS men by name, and they knew him. So here was a man in civilian clothes, armed, operating without uniform at a level of access most of the base wouldn't be cleared to touch. If you were an infantry officer or a junior NCO at Bessbrook in 1977 and you encountered someone like that, unregimented, ununiformed, clearly cleared for conversations you weren't, the obvious conclusion was SAS. SAS was the known quantity. SAS was the unit that worked in plain clothes, at arm's length from normal chains of command, hunting IRA in South Armagh. The men from the DET and the men from the SAS troop looked identical from 50 yards. Civilian clothes, concealed weapons, unmarked vehicles, the same hard-cornered civilian bearing that comes from operating with a gun under a jacket for months at a stretch. Former SAS soldier Ken Connor, who was involved in creating what would become 14 Intelligence Company, wrote that had Nairac actually been SAS, he wouldn't have been allowed to operate as independently and unsupervised as he did. The unit's own internal logic argued against the assumption, but outsiders couldn't see that logic. The whole architecture of 14 Intelligence Company was designed so they couldn't. Nairac's name does not appear on the SAS memorial wall at Hereford, which lists every fallen SAS soldier. The military never confirmed his association with the regiment. Military historian Alan Malcher has stated explicitly that Nairac wasn't an SAS officer, that this is a recurrent journalistic error. John Parker's biography describes him as not a fully fledged member of 14 Intelligence Company, but as a liaison officer attached to its operations, a Grenadier Guards officer on special duties. The IRA communiqué after his killing characterized him as SAS, claiming he had confessed this identity under interrogation. The British Army denied both the alleged confession and the SAS label. Academic literature has repeated the mistake for decades. He had trained with the SAS. He worked alongside the SAS. He attended a specific SAS-run course at Hereford geared to operations in Northern Ireland. His entire professional world at Bessbrook revolved around SAS liaison. But the unit he belonged to was a different animal, operating by different rules and for different purposes, and it maintained that distinction precisely by keeping it invisible. The confusion wasn't the exception, it was how the system worked. Robert Lawrence Nairac was born in Mauritius on 31st of August 1948, the youngest of 4 children. His father was a surgeon of French Mauritian descent, his mother English. The family moved to the northeast of England when he was a toddler. He was educated at Gilling Castle Preparatory School, then Ampleforth College, the Catholic boarding school in North Yorkshire. He went up to Lincoln College, Oxford, reading medieval and military history. He boxed for the university, winning 4 blues against Cambridge. He kept a falcon in his rooms. The bird was used in the 1969 film Kes. He left Oxford in 1971, entered Sandhurst under Grenadier Guards sponsorship, and after commissioning undertook postgraduate studies at Trinity College, Dublin, before joining the regiment. His first tour of Northern Ireland came in 1973. The 2nd Battalion Grenadier Guards deployed to Belfast from July to October, responsible for areas including the Shankill Road and Ardoyne, the same North Belfast district whose name he would later borrow as a cover story. He stayed on as liaison officer for the incoming replacement battalion after his own unit departed for Hong Kong, narrowly avoiding a car bomb on the Crumlin Road. Rather than following the battalion east, he volunteered for intelligence duties. By 1974, he had passed selection for the Special Reconnaissance Unit and was attached to South Armagh under the 4 Field Survey Troop designation, a cover name for one of 14 Intelligence Company's 3 regional subunits, officially associated with the Royal Engineers to obscure its actual role. He served as liaison officer between the detachment, the local British Army Brigade, and RUC Special Branch. He was promoted to captain on the 4th of September 1975. His 4th and final tour brought him to Bessbrook as Milo to Headquarters 3 Infantry Brigade, with responsibilities connected to surveillance operations. By the time he made his final radio call on the 14th of May 1977, he had completed 4 tours of Northern Ireland, totalling 28 months in the province. That figure comes from the George Cross citation itself, the British state's own accounting of his service. 28 months in a province where most soldiers were rotated out after 4. Across those tours, he had acquired a detailed personal knowledge of Republican communities on both sides of the South Armagh border. their geography, their social structures, their pubs, their internal factional politics, the specific way a Belfast Republican spoke compared to someone from Crossmaglen. He believed, according to accounts quoted in subsequent reporting, that the key to British intelligence success against the IRA lay in exactly that kind of deep, granular, personal knowledge, a conviction that drove him repeatedly beyond the formal boundaries of his role. Ken Connor's assessment, that no one seemed to know who his boss was, that he appeared to have been allowed to get out of control, deciding himself what tasks he would do, describes a man who had, over 4 tours, largely written his own operational mandate. That profile explains how he ended up alone in a car park in South Armagh after midnight on a Saturday in May. It does not make it a sound decision. To understand what 14 Intelligence Company was, it helps to understand what preceded it. The Military Reaction Force, the MRF, had been the British Army's first attempt at covert intelligence collection in Northern Ireland, active from 1971. It ended in 1972 after its operations were compromised and brought under centralised control. The MRF had no coherent structure, no adequate oversight, and virtually no formal training. What replaced it was built on a completely different premise. The Special Reconnaissance Unit, later known as 14 Intelligence Company, known operationally as the DET, evolved from that wreckage through 1972 and 1973, with the SAS training wing involved in building the selection and training architecture from the beginning. A top-secret briefing prepared for Prime Minister Harold Wilson in April 1974 refers to the unit as the Special Reconnaissance Unit, explicitly states that its name and the details of its organisation had been kept secret, and notes that in theatre it operated under the cover name NITAT, NI, Northern Ireland Training and Advisory Team. Approximately 130 personnel under the direct command of HQ Northern Ireland. Not the SAS, not MI5. Intelligence Corps, structured for a specific and unusual purpose. 3 detachments covered 3 sectors of Northern Ireland. The South Det, working from Bessbrook, covered South Armagh. Selection was open to all branches of the armed services and to both men and women. 14 Intelligence Company was the first UK Special Forces type unit to include women operators. A design decision driven by operational logic rather than principle. A man and a woman sitting in a car outside a suspect's house looked like a couple. A lone man in a parked car looked like surveillance. Candidates who passed the 2-week selection course went through 6 months of specialised training and a 3-week detachment induction. The selection course used techniques borrowed from SAS selection and from wartime SOE tradecraft, loaded marches, intellectual tasks administered immediately after physical exhaustion, memory retention exercises, sleep deprivation, navigation under erratic schedules. Directing staff wore the berets of their original regiments: Parachute Regiment, Guards, Royal Navy, Royal Marines, deliberately signalling that this wasn't a regiment with a fixed identity, but a function assembled from across the services. What the training produced was operators who could function as ordinary members of the local population for extended periods. They bought clothes from charity shops and adapted their hairstyles to local fashions. If a cover was blown, protocol required the clothing to be destroyed or replaced immediately. They drove Q cars, ordinary-looking saloon cars fitted internally with hidden radios, covert cameras, armour panels, engine cut-off systems, and in some versions, brake light switches that could be disabled to allow silent drop-offs and pickups in the dark. Concealed earpieces and throat microphones meant operators could maintain continuous communication on the radio net, talking to the ops room in real time, while sitting across a pub table from a target or walking through a market in full view of everyone around them. Their role was sustained covert surveillance, following suspects through towns and countryside, observing patterns of life over weeks or months, building the intelligence picture that enabled the RUC, or, where appropriate, the SAS, to act. They sat in observation posts for days at a time, attics, derelict buildings, undergrowth, watching a back door, a driveway, a field where arms were cached. They visited pubs and social venues in civilian guise, drinking at a plausible pace, engaging in conversation when the role required it, doing nothing that distinguished them from the regulars around them. They weren't a direct action unit. When SAS teams were running armed operations against IRA active service units, 14 intelligence company operators were often the ones who had spent weeks beforehand establishing where those men would be, which route they'd take, what time they moved. The overlap in appearance between the two units, civilian clothes, concealed weapons, unmarked vehicles, shared operational space at Bessbrook, produced the persistent SAS confusion. From the outside, they looked identical. The operational logic was entirely different. The DET watched, the SAS acted. And between those two functions, Nairac operated as the connective tissue. The man who moved the intelligence picture from one side to the other, cleared for both worlds, formerly belonging to neither in the way outsiders understood it. The alias he used at the 3 steps in has a name behind it, and the name belongs to a real person. Danny McErlaine. The cover identity Nairac carried that night was based on a real individual, Daniel McErlaine, aged 25, whose death is recorded in the Kane-Sutton Index on the 3rd of June 1978. The index classifies him as Catholic, civilian, killed by the IRA, shot. A Guardian account identifies him as Daniel McErlaine from Rasharkin in County Antrim, found dead near the border at the County Armagh village of Jonesborough. Secondary sources describe him as an official IRA man, reportedly on the run, killed by the Provisional IRA after stealing arms from the organisation, though the Kane record classifies him differently, and those specific biographical details appear across secondary retellings in near-identical wording, suggesting a single origin narrative being repeated rather than multiple independent accounts. Those details should be treated as reported, not confirmed. What is confirmed, a real man with that name existed, died in June 1978, and Nairac claimed to be him inside the 3 steps in, 13 months before that death. The operational logic behind using a real identity was specific. A plausible invented civilian cover might hold in a casual encounter, but in South Armagh's Republican communities, dense social networks, long-established family connections, community structures explicitly attuned to identifying outsiders and informers, a cover story needed more than coherence. It needed legibility. An official IRA man from Ardoyne gave Nairac a specific neighbourhood, a specific accent reference, a specific political affiliation, specific biographical details he could speak to if pressed. It gave him a place in the mental map any Republican in that room would carry. Accounts from that night suggest he used the cover convincingly enough to hold the room for approximately 2 hours. The risks were structural and immediate. Any patron with genuine connections to Ardoyne could have tested the cover in 30 seconds. Any contact between Nairac and someone who had actually met Daniel McErlaine would have broken it. The spelling of the alias varies across sources: McErlaine, McErlaine, McAlevey in at least one account, which suggests Nairac may himself have been working from partial intelligence on the man he was impersonating. There was a further layer of exposure that the alias itself created. An official IRA man. a sticky in the vernacular of the Troubles, from a rival Republican faction that had declared a ceasefire in 1972 in a South Armagh pub associated with provisional IRA men, and their community carried its own built-in incongruity. The officials and the provisionals had split bitterly in 1969 and 1970. A sticky showing up in Dromintee in 1977, asking about border crossing routes without army checkpoints, was already a slightly wrong note in a room calibrated to hear wrong notes. The alias provided legibility at the cost of introducing an anomaly that a sufficiently attentive person might notice. Whether this was authorized by his commanding officers or was another instance of Nairac's habit of operating beyond the formal boundaries of his role, the record does not clearly establish. Technical descriptions of 14 intelligence companies' operational method emphasize fabricated legends and generic civilian identities rather than borrowed real ones. The alias use appears in the available record as a specific tactic on that specific night, not a codified debt procedure. What happened to Danny McErlaine 13 months after Nairac's death changes nothing about what happened in the car park in May 1977. But it carries a particular weight when you note it. The real man behind the borrowed identity was killed by the same Republican movement that killed the officer who borrowed his name. The alias outlived Nairac by 13 months. The man it named didn't survive either. South Armagh in May 1977 wasn't generically dangerous. It was structured to be dangerous in specific ways, and those specificities matter for understanding what the Three Steps car park represented as an end state rather than a bad night. Merlin Rees, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, had described the area as bandit country in January 1976, following the sectarian massacres at Whitecross and King's Mill. The phrase wasn't melodrama. The South Armagh Brigade of the Provisional IRA was responsible for the deaths of large numbers of British Security Forces members across the Troubles. Ground movement by uniformed soldiers on South Armagh roads had become so dangerous by the mid-1970s that the British Army had shifted largely to helicopter transport, not by preference, but because road movement produced unacceptable casualties. The South Armagh Brigade, unlike IRA structures elsewhere in Northern Ireland, reportedly retained a battalion organisation rather than the smaller cell structure the Belfast units had been forced to adopt after repeated intelligence failures. The reason for that difference was the same reason that made South Armagh so dangerous for plain clothes work. The community's close-knit family and social networks made infiltration difficult and made outsiders visible. Everyone knew their neighbours. Everyone knew who belonged and who didn't. The social cohesion that protected the IRA from informers was the same social cohesion that made every stranger in a local pub an object of scrutiny. The border community of Dromintee wasn't a randomly hostile environment. It was a specifically organised one. Dromintee, the village is spelled both ways in the record, sits close to the Jonesborough border crossing into County Louth. The B113 road runs between Newry and Fork Hill through this stretch of South Armagh, passing through townland boundaries that locals could navigate blindfolded. A vehicle leaving the Three Steps car park after midnight could be across the border within a short drive, beyond immediate British military response and into the jurisdiction of the Gardaí. The geography wasn't incidental to what happened. It was why that particular car park, in that particular community, on that particular side of the border, was the right location to take a captive if you needed to move him fast and without British Army pursuit. A stranger in the Three Steps asking about routes across the border without Army checkpoints. which accounts from that night suggest Nairac did, likely as part of establishing his cover as a man with operational reasons to need such knowledge, was generating precisely the attention the cover was meant to deflect. Men in that pub could make a border-crossing call without rehearsing the logistics. A man who needed to ask about it was a man who didn't already know. That gap was audible. He left base at 21:25. His last radio call, at 21:58, told Bessbrook Mill he had arrived and would be closing communications. A party of British soldiers was positioned not more than 100 yards from the pub that night, close enough to hear music from the bar, but Nairac's concealed radio proved unreachable at the moment it mattered. The detail is exact and cold. Military backup within earshot, unreachable. The radio had likely been disrupted in the struggle, or the concealment prevented its use. The soldiers outside didn't know what was happening in the car park. Inside, Nairac had been working the room for approximately 2 hours. He moved between groups, held conversations, spoke about himself as Danny McErlaine would, the motor mechanic from Ardoyne, the Republican credentials, the casual familiarity with the things such a man would know and care about. He sang with the band. The Broad Black Brimmer is a Republican standard, a song of the IRA, exactly the kind of song a man with his stated affiliations would know and perform without prompting. He sang it. Witnesses later described him as getting up with the band and performing, which required not only knowing the words, but knowing how to perform it. The correct register of enthusiasm, the right balance between sentiment and restraint that a man in his supposed position would strike. He was also, accounts suggest, generating small friction. He talked about lost cigarettes. He asked about border crossing routes without checkpoints. These may have been deliberate cover behaviours, ways of establishing the legend. But in that room, among those people, they were being noticed and catalogued. Some of the younger men in the bar watched him during his singing rather than joining in. By degrees, the room had begun to measure him. Not with alarm, perhaps, not yet, but with the particular attentiveness that close-knit communities in volatile territory extend to anyone they can't immediately place. Sometime around 23:45, several men walked him out. The sequence in the car park is recorded through subsequent court proceedings and the George Cross citation. Terry McCormick challenged him. When McCormick struck him and he fell, Nairac landed with a metallic sound, and McCormick understood that the man he'd hit was armed. He called for help. Nairac's Browning 9mm pistol fell to the ground in the struggle. The George Cross citation, the most authoritative public account of what followed, states that he was abducted by at least 7 men, and that he put up fierce resistance before being overpowered. A BBC account notes he was struck from behind with a fence post. He was a physically capable man, 4 years of university boxing, fit from multiple operational tours. But 7 isn't a number that individual capability resolves. He was forced into a vehicle and driven across the border into County Louth. An IRA member joined the group once they had crossed. Nairac was transported to a rural location in North County Louth. Accounts name the area near Ravensdale or Flurry Bridge, with some variation across sources on the precise micro-location. The terrain mattered. Isolated farmland, darkness, no British military jurisdiction. The George Cross citation describes what followed with unusual specificity for an official state document. It calls the interrogation a succession of exceptionally savage assaults in an attempt to extract information which would have put other lives and future operations at serious risk. He made repeated attempts to escape. He was overpowered each time by weight of numbers. Accounts drawn from RTE Primetime's reconstruction and from the South African Military History Society lecture on the case record that he was kicked, punched, beaten with sticks and staves, pistol-whipped, that the interrogation continued over a period of roughly 2 hours as his captors tried to break what he claimed to be and extract something true. He stuck to Danny McErlaine, motor mechanic, Ardoyne, official IRA. Even in extremis, even when the people around him likely understood that no motor mechanic from Ardoyne would absorb what he was absorbing without breaking, he held the cover. One of his captors, Terry McCormick, who had been first to challenge him in the car park, posed as a priest, offering him the chance to confess. It was a specific tactic. Offer the sacrament of confession, and a man trained in the Catholic tradition might lower his guard in the presence of what he believed was a priest, might confirm his real name, his real unit, his real purpose. Nairac's last words before the ruse was dropped, according to McCormick's own account, were, "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned." He kept the cover through a fake confession. The citation's conclusion is precise and unembellished. These efforts to break Captain Nairac's will failed entirely. He was shot dead by Liam Townsend, an IRA member from the village of May outside Newry. Townsend was convicted by the Special Criminal Court in Dublin on the 8th of November 1977 and sentenced to penal servitude for life, serving 13 years before his 1990 release. During his Garda interrogation, Townsend made 2 admissible statements. The first began, "I shot the British captain. He never told us anything. He was a great soldier." That wording was considered significant enough by the British authorities that it was subsequently incorporated directly into the George Cross citation. The adversarial source chain is worth noting. A Republican killer in custody in the Republic of Ireland telling Garda detectives that the man he shot had refused to break, and that statement entering the official British record as evidence of gallantry. Townsend had every reason to claim the opposite. He didn't. 5 other men were subsequently convicted in Northern Ireland courts for offences connected to the abduction and murder. Gerard Fearon, Thomas Morgan, Daniel O'Rourke, Michael McCoy and Owen Rocks, for offences committed between 13th and 16th of May 1977. The charges included murder, manslaughter, kidnap, firearms offences, IRA membership and withholding information. Fearon and Morgan were convicted of murder. O'Rourke was acquitted of murder but convicted of manslaughter and jailed for 10 years. The case generated convictions across 2 separate jurisdictions and 2 court systems. Nairac's body was never recovered. He is classified among the Northern Ireland disappeared, 3 victims of the Troubles whose graves remain unknown and whose cases fall under the Independent Commission for the Location of Victims' Remains. Searches have continued in County Louth, most recently at a site near Forhart in the autumn of 2024, without result. In the spring of 2025, an IRA source was quoted as saying the body would never be located. The Commission continues its work. The ground hasn't yielded anything. On the 13th of February 1979, the London Gazette published the posthumous award of the George Cross to Captain Robert Lawrence Nairac. The citation names his parent regiment as the Grenadier Guards. It describes his role as a liaison officer at Headquarters 3 Infantry Brigade, whose task was connected with surveillance operations. It records 4 tours, totaling 28 months. It describes the events of 14 and 15th May 1977 in considerable detail. The abduction by at least 7 men, the sustained assault, the repeated escape attempts, the refusal to yield information, the murder, the assassin's words. It calls his courage second to none. The George Cross is awarded for acts of the greatest heroism in circumstances of extreme danger, where purely military honours, the Victoria Cross, aren't considered applicable. It was instituted by King George VI in September 1940 specifically to recognise gallantry among civilians and, by extension, military personnel in circumstances outside conventional battlefield combat. Its award to Nairac acknowledged, officially and permanently, that this man had undergone something extraordinary and had not yielded under it. The citation does not name 14 Intelligence Company. It does not name the Special Reconnaissance Unit. It does not acknowledge any covert formation, any surveillance unit, any organisation whose existence the British government had not placed on the public record. The state decorated the man while declining to name the institution that had deployed him. The citation describes surveillance operations at a headquarters. It names no unit conducting those operations. The omission wasn't accidental. The April 1974 briefing prepared for Harold Wilson had made the intended secrecy explicit, noting the unit's name and the details of its organisation and mode of operations had been kept secret. The Prime Minister knew what the Special Reconnaissance Unit was. The public didn't. That arrangement didn't change when one of its officers was killed in County Louth. It didn't change when he was decorated 19 months later. A Hansard record from 15th December 1988, more than 11 years after Nairac's death, shows a Member of Parliament asking the Secretary of State for Defence when 14 Intelligence Company was formed and whether it was still operative. The government's response does not constitute official confirmation of the unit's existence, role, or structure. An MP asking a question in the Commons chamber isn't the government providing an answer. The question was asked. The question was, in the available record, deflected. The formal acknowledgement came on 5 April 2005, when Defence Secretary Geoffrey Hoon made a written ministerial statement announcing the creation of the Special Reconnaissance Regiment and naming 14 Intelligence Company as one of its antecedent units. The Special Reconnaissance Regiment came formally into existence on 6 April 2005. From 14 intelligence companies' operational beginnings in 1972 and 1973 to that ministerial statement, approximately 32 years. From Nairac's death in May 1977 to Hoon's statement, nearly 28 years. The George Cross citation describing surveillance operations at Headquarters 3 Infantry Brigade in South Armagh had been public record since February 1979. The unit those surveillance operations belonged to wasn't. What this produces, in the official record, is a British officer posthumously decorated for dying inside a formation his government wouldn't confirm existed, using a cover identity borrowed from a real person, in an operational environment the same citation describes in considerable detail, with all of it placed on the official record, while the institutional structure behind it remained undeclared for another quarter-century. Britain named the act. The London Gazette named the man. The unit's parliamentary acknowledgement would wait 26 more years. Every element of the Nairac case moves along the same track. The SAS misidentification at Bessbrook wasn't a random error. It was the predictable output of running a covert intelligence unit from the same base as a better-known covert unit, under a designation no one on the outside was permitted to know. The colleagues who assumed SAS weren't naive. They were working with the information they had, and the information they had was specifically designed to point them wrong. That is what a functioning cover architecture produces. The Danny McErlaine alias wasn't theatrical invention. It was the operational logic of deep cover pushed to its limit in a community where a fabricated nobody would hold less time than a borrowed somebody. And it came attached to structural vulnerabilities that no amount of performance could fully close. The lethal specifics of South Armagh in 1977 weren't generic troubles danger. They were the particular conditions that made intelligence work essential, that made it impossible to do safely, and that made the cover something that had to hold all the way to the end, because the end came in a field in County Louth with no backup and no radio and no exit. The unrecovered body isn't a mystery to be resolved with additional effort. It's the end point of a killing conducted outside formal IRA command structures by a group of men who have since scattered, which the Commission has been unable to fully reconstruct for nearly 50 years. Accounts suggest Nairac was first buried somewhere on farmland and later reburied elsewhere, with the details held by men who haven't disclosed them, and at least one of whom died in a road accident in 1987. The ground in County Louth hasn't yielded anything. The Commission continues to look. And the George Cross, dated 13th February 1979, awarded to a Grenadier Guards captain for surveillance operations at Headquarters 3 Infantry Brigade. That citation describes, in careful official language, everything that happened except the unit it happened in the name of. Liam Townsend, convicted in Dublin, told the Gardaí, "He never told us anything." The British government, in its ministerial responses, its parliamentary deflections, and its careful gazetting of a citation that describes the mission without naming the formation, maintained a parallel discipline for 28 years. Not silence exactly, acknowledgement without disclosure, recognition without identification. The state knew what Nairac had been. It said so obliquely in the citation. It didn't say what unit had put him there. He refused, under interrogation the state itself described as exceptionally savage, to confirm he was a British officer. His captor's own recorded word is that he held the cover to the end. Britain, for its part, confirmed he was a British officer, while maintaining the unit's cover for another quarter-century after his death. The operational logic ran in both directions. The man protecting the mission, the institution protecting the unit, each silence holding the other in place. The George Cross marks the man. The empty ground in County Louth marks the mission. The gap between the George Cross citation of February 1979 and Geoffrey Hoon's ministerial statement of April 2005 marks the institution. Robert Nairac is what 14 Intelligence Company looked like when the cover failed and the officer inside it didn't. Subscribe for more stories like this.